It's Thursday morning, and welcome to day 4 of the Guion course on post-colonial eco-criticism. And we will start right with lecture 10. But before I get to that, I promise to come back briefly. I will try to be brief on just a couple of points from the writers I did not have time for yesterday. And those are Wole Soyinka and Siti Dangaremga, and perhaps very, very briefly, not doing her justice, Chimamanda Adichie. And I think it's helpful to think about these. We're always looking for connections between these writers, after all. So Wole Soyinka, in his that famous work I mentioned, actually it's 1976, so it's quite some time ago. Myth, Literature, and the African World. I will just mention a couple of parts. I didn't do justice to it yesterday, and you were probably a little confused because I was mentioning the god Ogun, the Yoruba god. But his point is not to. His point is more a Pan-African idea of how the West, or outsiders, anyone, it doesn't have to be the Western Academy, can be more sensitive to local belief systems, right? And he is really, I guess one of the points I wanted to share was he has been trying to create an African cosmogony, right, that allows for this indigenous critique we were talking about. So he doesn't want to get rid of all the Western tropes or paradigms or concepts. So let me just say this, and then I'll move on. So this Ogun myth, and you don't have to remember it, but what's interesting is some of these, like Sango, a couple of these gods, from my understanding, limited understanding, reappear in the southern U.S. and in the Caribbean in the form of voodoo, which comes from Western Africa. Because the slaves came from mostly Western Africa, so you have some of those gods reappearing. And when we get to the African American lecture, I'll say something more about that. So he says that he wants to create this coherent African cosmology to decenter the European mythology and sort of Judeo-Christian critique, which is nothing wrong. It fits Europe, but it doesn't speak to his area. So it's a decentering of an alien vision that involves a necessary part of authentic modernization, which may be a contradiction in terms, but that's what he's after. So I wanted to share that. If you're interested, that work is rather dense. I haven't read all of it, to be honest. So I like to read interpretations of it. But it has been influential. And then now we come to, as I mentioned, here's the other writer that I just finished teaching again for the third time. And one of my favorite novels is Nervous Conditions, 1988, by Tsitsi Dangaremga. And she, of course, as I said, titles her book. Her book's title comes from a phrase in Wretched of the Earth, right? And she has the epigraph there. And she's a trained psychologist. And Fanon, as we've been talking about, says the condition of the native is a nervous condition. That's the line she quotes. What is fascinating is that she does a wonderful job of showing how anxiety, nervousness, wrought by the upheaval of the colonial encounter, of colonialism, how that affects both an individual and a culture. It affects an individual in unique ways, but there are these broad ways of thinking about the culture. This takes place in Zimbabwe, which of course was Rhodesia at the time. So Zimbabwe becomes independent and changes its name in 1980. The novel is published in 1988, but it's set in the late 60s. So again, we have a child's eye view mostly, and we have her cousin, and this is fascinating. Her cousin has lived 3 years in England because her uncle, this narrator's name is Thambu, and her uncle has got risen right within the colonial apparatus, and he's risen to a respected, learned English, getting educated. So he goes to England to get a master's degree, so that his daughter, who's just a year or so older than the narrator, becomes really confused because she's now anglicized, and she comes back and she has anorexia nervosa, which tends to be a sort of Western phenomenon. It could be genetic partly, they think. But in any case, the point is, she's refusing to eat, so that becomes a symbol as well as a reality, right? I mean, we are symbolic creatures, right? So we say, I'm hungry for knowledge. There's a reason for that. So she actually is hungry. She studies, but she refuses to eat because that's her way of resisting her parents, who want her to fit they expect, I've had friends go through this, so they expect her to suddenly switch and move right back into the traditional cultural system, right? And that's very unfair to someone who's a formative age. So that's what I like. The other thing is it does deal with education, which is a huge theme. And it's always that ambivalence, right, about the education. Now, that's still the British system. So clearly it's an anglicized and a biased education. But nonetheless, she doesn't paint it like it's nuanced. So there are some, English people who are helpful, some aren't, and so forth. But I think the other thing is there's a theme of bilingualism, how that shapes your identity, perhaps. And there's also, if you're interested, the motif of food is an important part of post-colonial writing. This is not directly eco-criticism, but I just thought I would mention it. My former mentor, Paroma Roy, has written alimentary tracts. Tracts is a pun, T-R-A-C-T, tracts, but also written things. And so food is really powerful in all these novels, even Laurel Hodges I mentioned the other day. So I think those are the main things I wanted to mention. If you're interested, I would always be happy to talk more about this. So Tsitsidan Garemga's 1988 book, Nervous Conditions. Finally, just a nod to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Purple Hibiscus. The only novel I've taught two novels by her, neither of which is this. One is Americana, and one is Half of a Yellow Sun, about the Nigerian Civil War I mentioned. And in all of these, I think, even in Dangaremga's book, landscape comes up, because the narrator grows up poor, having to, they are subsistence farmers. They grow corn, right, which is not even native to their culture. And they have to eke out this living. And then when they see the opportunity for a scholarship to mission school, that's like, a godsend in the 1960s. So landscape, we looked at Ngugi's The River Between, right? This idea of landscape. When we get, if you remind me, when we get to the Native American writers today, M. Scott Momaday, I will show an image of an indigenous map drawn in the 19th century by a Native American. There are different ways to produce maps, right? We think there's only one way now. Adichie's novel is a coming-of-age story about, again, characters going through psychological and moral growth from childhood to adulthood again, right? That happens a lot. Some of you may have read this, and I don't know how, I can't really judge how it compares to her other works. It's Americana's been a huge bestseller because, of course, it deals with America and the West to some degree. But in this one, I think we have a 15-year-old who is a teenage girl. Again, these are another note to make is these are women writers. So we have the focus on women, domesticity, and those who resist that, right? And it doesn't matter what class you are, right? There are characters who are going to rebel, like Lucia in Dangaremga's novel. And she, again, is sort of outshadowed by her sort of respected father, who's a philanthropist, and so forth. Religion makes an appearance to some degree, Catholicism, as it does in many of these novels, right? By the way. So let me just see, I won't go over it more, but one of the characters moves to America, so we do have this kind of cross-cultural experience, but we also have people who deteriorate psychologically, and I think that's fascinating, that the psychological angle, and that these are women writers because the pressures, they're confined so often, right? And we know that from feminist writing, even from in Victorian England, British writing, and so on. So I think that comes into play. As far as the landscape, it's not directly about that. And I don't think Adichie talks about that directly, so I'm not going to force an eco-critical reading. But I think it's useful to keep the title in mind, right? Which is, after all, a flower. So a floral motif that can be interpreted in different ways. So there are ways to read that. Now to specifically Lecture 10, African-American Voices. Jean Toomer's Cain. Jean is a male writer. And this book came out in 1923 as part of the Harlem Renaissance, which was infused, interestingly enough, by many Caribbean writers, not all, and had a number of women writers, which again was rare at the time. It was I've taught, for example, classic canonical American works like The Great Gatsby, which is a great novel, which came out in 1925. But Fitzgerald had no clue about the Harlem Renaissance, right? So some of the writers like Langston Hughes become important later on and do attract attention. Cain was appreciated by his peers, but did not really gain traction until maybe a generation later, and now is considered a classic. For some context, some of you know this, but W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk, came out in 1903, a classic still, has always been in print. What's interesting about Cain and Du Bois's work is that they are multi-genre, they're hybrid texts, because Du Bois was a sociologist, he was a professor, an African-American professor. Very eloquent, right? He wrote academic books. But in this book, he wanted to reach a larger audience and also to capture something of the spirit of what it meant to be African American. That's hard to do, right? So I'm giving you Du Bois because this is important context. So about 20 years before Cain, you have Du Bois, and you can't really talk about African American literature without talking about Du Bois, who coined the famous term double consciousness, right? For how African Americans still have to learn. We know this everywhere in the world. There are certain groups that have to learn to traverse and learn the idioms and the mannerisms of the elite, of the dominant group, even though in their own homes and so forth and communities, they would have a different way of talking. That, he said, is a burden, but it also can be empowering, because then you can, after all, it's like being bilingual, in a sense. The other reason to mention Du Bois is which is related to Cain, is he has a lot of songs in there. African-American spirituals, or gospel, maybe you've heard of this. This is really what shaped rock music and the blues. That's from African-American, right? You would not have rock music or pop music and all this stuff without African-American music. Jazz is a big part of this, right? Jazz is improvisational, right? We know this in Indian music. You have a riff, as they say in African-American lingo, and then you play with that, right? So no one performance is the same. How do you do that in writing? I don't know. You can do that with a drama, with plays. But with writing, you can approximate the spontaneity. You can't really do it, but you can have characters who are doing it. You can describe characters. But I think this hybrid genre of having songs, right, spirituals, and then sort of straight narration, commentary, those kinds of things, right? So Cain has aphorisms. It has beautiful poems. I'll read a little bit for you. It has prose, and it's almost like a mix of some of the same characters. For example, we have the short story tradition of the linked short story. There are different names for that, right? We have Dubliners by Joyce. Sort of the same milieu, set in the same. Faulkner does that. He sometimes has some of the same characters. So what he does here is similar, except now it's different genres. So song becomes is very important to African American. To this day, for example, African American choirs don't use written music, right? My friends in the African American choirs they don't know how to read the music, and that because they don't need it. Whereas all the white singers, yeah, and it's like we can't do anything without the text, and so it's this idea of orality still there, and and this is where some African American theorists have really brilliantly tried to, like Henry Louis Gates Jr., have tried to theorize this. So Cain, let me just read a bit of this. And again, I think there are so many wonderful interpretations of this, so I can't do justice to them. But this is called Harvest Song. And think about the title, Cain. Now, this is someone writing in New York City, right? He has not really worked in the fields. And I will show you two images in just a minute to clarify this. I am a reaper whose muscles set at sundown. All my oats are cradled, but I am too chilled and too fatigued to bind them, and I hunger. I crack a grain between my teeth, I do not taste it. I have been in the fields all day, my throat is dry, I hunger. Notice the repetition. My eyes are caked with dust of oat fields at harvest time. I am a blind man who stares across the hills, environment, seeking stacked fields of other harvesters. It would be good to see them. Crooked, split, and iron-ringed handles of the scythes. It would be good to see them dust-caked and blind. I hunger. Dusk is a strange, feared sheath. Their blades are dulled in. My throat is dry. And should I call a cracked grain like the oats? ... Eho. He uses a kind of, I think, an approximation of an African expression, right? It's not, as my understanding, it's not uh, very American. I fear to call. What should they hear me? And offer me their grain, oats, or wheat, or corn? I have been in the fields all day. I fear I could not taste it. I fear knowledge of my hunger. My ears are cracked with dust of oat fields at harvest time. So the repetition, right? Song like. I am a deaf man who strains to hear the calls of other harvesters whose throats are also dry. It would be good to hear their songs. Reapers of the sweet stalked cane, cutters of the corn, even though their throats cracked and the strangeness of their voices deafened me. I hunger, my throat is dry. Now that the sun has set and I am chilled, I fear to call. Eh ho, my brothers, I am a reaper, eh ho, all my oats are cradled, but I am too fatigued to bind them and I hunger. I crack a grain, it has no taste to it. My throat is dry. Oh, my brothers, I beat my palms still soft against the stubble of my harvesting. You beat your soft palms too. My pain is sweet, sweeter than the oats or wheat or corn. It will not bring me knowledge of my hunger. If we had time, we could explore all the imagery there, right? That is fascinating, very interesting, right? Now, one thing to keep in the back of our minds, I don't have an answer for, is why there were Harlem Renaissance writers who were publishing straight poetry like Langston Hughes, right? Poetry volumes, many, many. Claude McKay, and others. But he chooses to have this hybrid text. So this is a song-like part of Cain. There are prose-like parts. So partly, one could argue that he is trying to emblematize or put on display was I doing that? Put on display this idea of hybridity, of mixed cultures. After all, these are genres that the mainstream press has imposed, right? You can do a poetry anthology, you can do this, but he says no. And Du Bois did the same. He also said he was experimenting, right? The other thing I would just say is the cane, C-A-N-E, has to do with then the sugar cane, right? But here's a writer who has not worked in the fields himself, but and by the way, he was also, interestingly enough, kind of could sometimes pass for a non-African American. Do you know what the word passing? There's a great novel, Nella Larson's novel, which was just reissued recently. Passing, and then she has a book called Quicksand. So that colorism is present. So why choose Cain? Because in a way that haunts the African American experience. After all, 1923, they're not that far removed from slavery. Literally, slavery is abolished officially by Lincoln in 1863, but they don't hear about it till 1865. Today, now we have a national holiday in the U.S. called Juneteenth, which is the day on which they received the news. Because the Southern forces weren't defeated until 65, they refused to set them free, and so finally they only learned 2 years later that there was this emancipation. So today, which is a good sign, right? They do this, they have Juneteenth. So when you think about it, that's only, 60, 70 years later, 60 years. The parents of some of the Harlem Renaissance writers had been slaves. That's astonishing, right? So what haunts them are the plantations. So I have two images I'd just like to show, which could serve for all of the African American, so many writings, not all. And those images are the plantation slave labor. One's a painting, and one is a painting of sort of contemporary time, like from the 19th century. Yeah. And you'll see that it's very 19th century style, that one. And you can see they're picking cotton in the South, right? By the way, this had some things to do with globalized trade with India because the British couldn't get their cotton from the south anymore, so they turned to India and Egypt and other places. And then the other image is that's the actual slave labor on a plantation. And then the next image, you'll see a nice quaint picture of a plantation owner's house. Now, in the southern U.S., some especially white people, like to have wedding pictures here without really thinking about the history, right? Even though the history is told there, and you can see that. I was at the University of Virginia many, many years ago, and Thomas Jefferson founded that university. And when I was there in the 80s, 1980s, the tour guides never talked about that he owned slaves. By the late 1990s, they did. So that's progress, right? Because there are slave quarters, right? Okay, so the plantation, on the one hand, you have, so these are opposing views. You have the plantation is, like as Fanon said, a space divided in two, right? You have the fancy home, like the manors of England, created on the backs of slaves. And you have also African Americans know this very well, house slaves and field slaves. When Malcolm X was taught, you can watch some of his videos. I don't know if you know Malcolm X, yeah. And his autobiography is great, but you watch some of his videos and interviews, and he'll talk straight off, like it is, about the house. So someone who's in modern times a house slave, they don't use it much anymore. They sometimes say an Uncle Tom from Uncle Tom's Cabin is kind of a cop-out, a kind of a sellout, because they are seen as having, remember we talked about the post-colonial term, I just slipped my mind, not compadre, but the idea of the comprador, the compromised one, right? So in the same way, some African Americans will still turn to this. It's kind of fading away now, the new generation. These terms, it's not in the popular lingo, but certainly it's still around. So I thought I'd mention that. So think about, that's interesting. You have, thank you for those images. That's fine. So you have Gene Toomer not having experienced that directly, but it haunts him, perhaps his parents, right? Some of these writers, their parents, some came from the Caribbean, and they did grow up surrounded by this. Still, of course, the laborers were paid ostensibly very little, but it's still a very harsh existence. So the African American experience is, I think if you were to look at a survey, which independent of post-colonial eco-criticism, you would have to take into account Frederick Douglass, for example, the slave narratives, as they're called, the autobiographies of slaves, starting with Olaudah Equiano from the late 1700s, but especially in the American context with Frederick Douglass, who escapes at a young age, gets educated, and then ends up being a friend of Abraham Lincoln. So these are very powerful images. The Harlem Renaissance, of course, also coincides with, no, it doesn't quite coincide. In the 1930s, after the Depression, and especially after World War II, there was a great migration from the South of African Americans to the cities. So when we think of African Americans, we often think of urban, right? So until recently, eco-criticism was not seen as pertinent. But writers and scholars have shown that's not true. Right? You don't have to experience, as an author yourself, the conditions that you describe, because after all, that's why we have writing. It's the imagination. But your people can be haunted by this. So the theme of haunting and ghosts is very powerful. There was also a great anthropologist you may have heard of called Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote a book in the 1930s called Of Mules and Men, in which she collected from her hometown hundreds of stories, folk stories. She was educated at Columbia University. She also wrote the classic work, Their Eyes Were Watching God. James Baldwin, Richard Wright, Lorraine Hansberry, Gwendolyn Brooks. I'm going through a list of names. Ralph Ellison. I know that some of you know Amritjit Singh, who is a noted scholar of African-American writing, started at the University of Rajasthan here, became noted in the U.S., and he's long retired now, but his advisor was Ralph Ellison, the great writer. So that's pretty neat, right? As a young student, he got Ralph Ellison. If you're interested to get a sense of the civil rights struggle, you might look at Selma, the film, 2014 film of the civil rights struggle. Now, I do not want to stray from this idea of post-colonial eco-criticism. How does post-colonial studies help in this? And I certainly haven't mentioned so many names here. Because we also have post-apocalyptic novels by Octavia Butler, for example, who's African-American. She died relatively young in her 50s, but her books are, and they got a renewed life after the pandemic, right? As different as all these texts are, they do often share this, they definitely share the idea of injustice and justice, right? Race, these kinds of things. And so you could go from Jean Toomer to Octavia Butler, 1980s, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years difference, and very different, but sharing this impetus. So landscape becomes big because to this day, there are a number of African Americans, because of the Great Migration, they think of the South, that's the ambivalence, because the South was the plantation, right? But it's their homeland, they consider it. That's interesting, right? We talk about what homeland means. And homeland does not have to be somewhere you've been for 1,000 years, right? Very few people have stayed in one place for 1,000 years. So what is homeland? That's something else to think about. And I think all these novels explore that. So the other aspect that I'd like to talk about here is, I'll just read a couple of snippets from scholars who, histories of the plantation, to show you how graphic they are, and then I'm going to turn to Toni Morrison. And sometimes this is useful to pair just some examples of this with these novels. So here's an example of how horrific the slave conditions were, like in the 1850s, told by freed slaves many decades later, right? In the time of the Harlem Renaissance, they're still being interviewed. So this was what one slave, of course, as it's been set down, dictated. So on the plantation, the younger children were fed from a trough that was 20 feet in length. All the enslaved children stood back until the master had finished stirring the food. And then at a given signal, they dashed to the trough, where they began eating with their hands. Some even put their hands in the trough and ate. There were times when the master's dogs and some of the pigs that ran around the yard all came to the trough to share these meals. Mr. Wombo, whoever that is, states that they were not permitted to strike any of these animals so as to drive them away, and so they protected their faces from the tongues of the intruders by placing their hands on the sides of their faces as they ate. And remember this idea of animal imagery, right? So this is of course the worst kind of thing, is slavery, right? where you, in a sense, animalize, if we're going to use animal in the conventional sense of dehumanizing. There, we can talk about animal studies at another time. And that's how these slaves were seen, right? During the meal, the master walked from one end of the trough to the other to see that all is as it should be. So that's a graphic image of there I wanted to share with you. Here's another kind of image that was experienced by Harriet Tubman, who's a famous escaped slave who became a famous abolitionist and social activist. In fact, there was talk about 10 years ago of putting her on one of the US currency bills. And I thought that might happen, but administrations changed. Here's where eco-criticism. You can see this is what haunts these writings. The disabled Tubman went to work on a timber gang, so logging, exhibiting great skill in the logging camps and in the fields. There she was exposed to the secret communication networks that were the province of black watermen and other free and enslaved blacks. As one of the few women working in the forests on a timber gang, mostly it was men, Tubman became part of an exclusively male world. Here in the forests, beyond the watchful eye of the white masters, the male slaves had access to the free black watermen and black mariners. And these black men were part of a larger world, a world beyond the plantation, beyond the woods, that reached out to towns and cities. They knew the safe places. They knew the sympathetic whites, and more important, they knew the danger. They created a veiled and secret world parallel to the white master's world. So that's one part of this, right? So you have the forests where they were willing to brave whatever dangers there were. I don't think there were any really like dangerous predators or something, but nonetheless, you had to scrape for your food and so forth, but at least you were free, right? So that also is in the background here. And the idea of I just was trying to think of what was I going to say. Yes. So what Toni Morrison has said in a famous essay from 1992, it was actually a series of lectures called Playing in the Dark, which Richard Wright had said some similar things years before, the famous writer, that blackness has been a necessary part of the construction of whiteness. You know how sometimes you define yourself, right, in contrast to someone else, alterity, othering. Well, blackness was sort of the way that they could, not all whites, but generally, this is generally how America was structured, was even the writing. So she looks at classic writers whom she likes. She was actually an editor, right? Famous editor as well for a publishing house. Willa Cather, Ernest Hemingway, and so on. She looks at these white writers and can sort of make, just by little word mentions here and there, you can infer that, even if the blacks are invisible, sometimes they're mentioned, but even if they're invisible, you can infer that this depends on these structures. I was talking with someone about the Sublime and Edmund Burke's idea, right? Do you remember, if you've read the Sublime, how he talks about the black child and, this is the negation of whiteness. It's the same idea. But the thing is, in America, it was never said so boldly. It was sort of construed because, it was, they knew something told them that this was not right to say out loud. Okay, Toni Morrison's Beloved. I don't know how many of you have read it, but it's one of the great novels of American writing in the 20th century. 1987, the story of a post-Civil War in the 1870s, a family that is in a house that they believe is haunted by a malevolent spirit. Remember the motif of haunting, right? But this is not really a magic realist novel. But nonetheless, there is a sense, it's clear that the ghost that appears at some point in the novel, which is that they call beloved, this is what the mother calls her, is real to these, right? It's not like, oh, it's purely a psychological projection, or but that's as far as that sort of supernatural goes, right? You can read it as psychological haunting, but but I think it's also, well, the premise here. Let me back up and say that there was something called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that the northern states kind of compromised and said, okay, if we have a runaway slave, we'll return for a short time. They did this. They'll return him. Of course, there are always people working to help the slaves, right? This is called the Underground Railroad. But at the same time, the southern states got this enacted, right? And this is all a prelude to the Civil War. So it's set in 1873 where the mother is Sethi, who harbors a secret. She was formerly enslaved, and we have her, she has a daughter named Denver who lives with her, and for a short time, a mother-in-law named Baby Suggs. And there's also a good guy, a former slave named Paul D, who comes in, and he is sort of the voice of, he's not from the part of the family, so he can kind of bring a slightly more objective view into this. But one day they come and they see sitting on the doorstep beloved. Now, those of you who know the novel will know this, but for those who don't, we find out she tells Paul D the story that she killed one of her own children because rather than have this child returned to slavery. So, infanticide by the mother is supposed to be the cardinal sin, right? But here's a woman who, did she do it? She did it out of love, right? So these ethical questions. And so what she feels is that this is the grown version of that child, that the ghost, beloved. That's what she believes. We are never told whether, as I said, it's presented matter-of-factly. We're never told whether it's really that someone else, but the point is, this was based on a real case that Morrison had read about. But she does this so brilliantly by talking about how this ghost haunts the novel. And I'll just, let me just read this summary from another, an online summary that was useful. So I thought I'll just read this. Sethi comes to believe that beloved is the daughter she had killed because beloved was the word, that's all she could afford on the gravestone. And so, you know, you might say, some people would say, well, why didn't she kill herself? You know, kind of thing. So these are all that she does feel guilt, but you know, she does have this guilt. So she begins to spend all her time and money on this ghostly figure, and the ghost becomes demanding and angry. So you can read this psychologically, right? She becomes obsessed with this. She hardly eats. There's the food. While beloved grows bigger and bigger, but not in a kind of Garcia Marquez kind of way. She just grows larger, and she looks like she's pregnant, ultimately. There's that ambivalence, too. Denver reveals her fear of Sethi, having known that she killed beloved, but not understanding why. And her brothers had run away, partly because of this. So Sethi and beloved's voices merge until they become indistinguishable. And Denver observes that Sethi becomes more like a child, while beloved seems more like a mother. Very interesting. So then they get some local African-American women to try to exorcise the ghost, to do rituals, right, to get it out, and so on. And Sethi does show signs of occasionally of madness, right? Um, and so one day, though, Beloved disappears. And Sethi is devastated, right? And she says that Beloved was her best thing, sort of meaning like that was the best thing that could happen, right? And Paul D says, no, you're your own best thing. And she goes, me? So it ends kind of there. So how do we interpret this? Well, ghosts in non-European expressive traditions can counter sort of Euro-American grand narratives of empiricism. We know this from interpretations of magical realism, right? That Garcia Marquez and others the maravilloso, the sort of the marvelous, right? The tradition, marvelous realism, as a Cuban Carpentier, the famous Cuban writer, coined the term. Whatever way you want to call it, it's a bit different from this, right? But nonetheless, in terms of how it's presented, but nonetheless, the ghost could be interpreted as sort of similar in the sense that these writers are taking folk traditions, right? The vernacular. These are not, educated and so forth, and they are making them real. You could see the enslaved child as one, as Avery Gordon says, who's written a wonderful 1997 work on ghosts, right? She's a sociologist, but she has a lot of literature in the book. Do you know, Isha, what the name of that is? You were nodding, but I can't remember the name of that book. Anyway, I hadn't thought to mention it, but it's a great book that I was reading recently. This is what she says. The enslaved child can be seen as metaphor, as weapon, as salve, as a fundamental epistemology for living in the vortex of North America. Interesting. That's a sociologist, right? And talking about literature, right? Ghostly Matters, yes, which is a very apt title. Yes. Thank you. Ghostly Matters, if you're interested. It's very readable. And it's been quite influential. Well, Morrison coined the term rememory, as you may know, to talk about not remembering in the classic way, but rememory in a kind of imaginative way to fill the gaps in history that the subaltern studies historians had always talked about, which is, remember those small stories, that the insignificant stories that never get told, women's stories, right? So rememory is how she sees part of her project as, and she has this interesting, it's a piece, short piece, 2019, called "I Wanted to Carve Out a World Both Culture Specific and Race Free." It's more like an interview. And she defines this as memory versus memorylessness. Rememory is in recollecting and remembering, as in reassembling the members of the body, the family, the population of the past, the effort to both remember and not know, right? You can't know like in a sense of a fact. Thus, in Beloved, the ghost refuses to go away and thereby resists the premise of the oppositional logic of alterity that undergirds Eurocentric modernity, which continues to see the binary, right, the world through a center-periphery lens that mystifies borders, nations, and exile. Morrison's ghost compels the reader to consider other ways of recording history, especially the history of people in a dominant society, who would rather forget this. And we see this now, as I said yesterday, enacted in textbooks in certain states. Not all states, about half the states. The very form of Morrison's novel resists the methodologies that rely on the reality-unreality. This, I know, is a big topic, realism and all of this, and I'm not, equipped. There's there's Riffater, sort of the French, is he French or British? Anyway, Riffater's fictional truth is, you can read a lot of sort of deconstructive criticism on this, but this really breaks that down. And so I'll just stop there, I think. Oh, I do want to quote Christine Gebhardt, who reads an African-American slave narrative this way, and I think this will be a good way to conclude. Not conclude, but I have to find the rest of my pages. Nature is a place in which the black protagonist constitutes his subject position as he hides from the symbolic power of the white colonizer's gaze. Positioning himself in nature means positioning himself beyond the reach of forced location. And we saw that with the actual some of the slaves going into the forest. That's well documented. So, let me just collect my thoughts, my notes, I should say. I think those are the main things. The only other thing I wanted to mention was, I wanted to mention a couple other things. One is an important concept called the signifying monkey that I just alluded to yesterday, and then I realized that I didn't really do justice to it, by Henry Louis Gates Jr., a 1988 book, The Signifying Monkey. Now, signifying, we all know from linguistics, right? De Saussure, and then we go on to Derrida, and we get lost in Derrida and so forth. But, but the idea of how the sign systems. But there is a Native African American tradition which is about, let's see, he uses the words signifying apostrophe, like he purposely drops the G, not in the title of the book, but in the inside, because that's the colloquial, and that distinguishes it from the linguistic, sort of the conventional linguistic sign system. And by this he means it's a concept of signification. Let's see. Gates plays off this idea of signifying and incorporates the linguistic concept of signifier and signified with the vernacular concept of signifying. So it takes the form of repetition, the alteration of another text. It has a bit of mimicry in it here, even though he doesn't mention it, which is it could encode admiration and respect. Not the, but it could also be sort of playful, tricksterish. So the trickster figure is a key part of this. It functions as a metaphor, signifying functions as a metaphor for formal revision, intertextuality within the African American vernacular system, but as rendered in writing. It can become a bit dense in term, because it's a bit slippery. But this comes off this idea in African American lingo of, I'm trying to find the word. It's a very common word. I'll come back to it if I remember it, but yeah. So this idea, for example, Ralph Ellison revises or signifies upon Richard Wright's work, just as Ishmael Reed, a famous playwright and poet, who's still alive, I think, goes on to signify on both these writers. So you know how we have intertextuality, right? So here we have a kind of riffing. Do you know that from jazz? You kind of you improvise by being inspired by these other texts, to the point where in some traditions in the world, people have been accused of plagiarism. Right? But plagiarism is a whole nother field that's interesting to think about, because, as many writers have said, writers are thieves, right? They take the best ideas and recombine them. but that becomes, it's a legal issue, but it's also a cultural one. One of the things, if you think about maybe a better analog is rap music.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so rap, they actually have it started as something called the dozens, and they'd sit on these doorsteps and they'd have contests. They still do. And maybe you've seen these portrayed, you know, contests in how good you are at rapping, right? If you've seen the play Hamilton, for example, it's all about that, right? That Lin-Manuel Miranda grew up in New York City, so it doesn't have to be only African Americans. So I want to. I think we're just about out of time. I think those were the main points I wanted to talk about. So just to reiterate, the idea of the haunting, the plantation. The plantation is ambivalent. It is on the one hand a place of labor and a scar, but on the other hand, this is quite ambivalent because on the other hand, that's kind of seen as a homeland because that's where your forebears came from, right? That's where all these songs that Du Bois and Toomer incorporate were formed. That's the paradox of humanity, right? And so to this day, and in fact, a lot of, I don't know if it's still happening, but maybe, I'm guessing maybe 10 years ago, I remember reading that there was all these, fairly doing well, young black professionals were moving from the northern cities back to the south because they could afford now to move where they want to move, right? They weren't moving as economic refugees, if that makes sense. So interesting, right? So what's haunting them? It doesn't mean it's a negative thing always. And then the other thing is this idea of spontaneity and riffing, and that Henry Louis Gates tries to talk about. So I think we'll stop there. I think those are the main points I wanted to make, and save your questions too for the end of today, if you have any, on these. And so that ends lecture 10.